Soul, noun, the principle of life, feeling, thoughts, and action in humans regarded as a distinct entity separate from the body and commonly held to be separable in existence from the body. Philanthropy, noun, altruistic concern for human welfare and advancement. If you believe you are too small to make a difference, you haven't yet spent the night with the mosquito. African proverb. Awe-inspiring collectives can be found in the tiniest corners of nature, like neurons or insects. Collectives like these aspen trees, collectives like starlings blanketing the sky. To live, to thrive, evidence of having enough, maybe even enough to distribute in spite of inhibited acquisition, to lift upon air with seemingly clipped wings, to inflate new idea with pressed upon lung, manifesting this philanthropic soul. We have always built the boots and the straps and the sinew tensed for pulling. We have always responded to need with familiar capability, an extra ladle dished onto an unplanned plate, an extra blanket on a bed laced foot to foot with cousins, always giving first. Consistent solemn promises to never stand idle in the face of our brethren's need, in the face of our sistren's loss, in the face of vicious threat. There is active work to inhibit our vision. Machines reading biometrics as though a computer camera could recognize our flesh more clearly than a neighbor's caring eye. This narrative of destitution, endless and monolithic and almost always inaccurately reported because I've never once met a welfare queen. I don't know any thugs crossing the border, only families in need. And of course, currency is a limited tool. Truthfully, the weakest resource we own. It cannot respond and understand the way a heart might. It does not plan and engage the way a mind might. Capitally seems to allow mastery of experience, but experience was not always currency's pet. Once it roamed unbridled between humans in our own homes. This general understanding of our inherent value. How does humanity's value save itself from the maw of industrial greed? How do we fly free without risking ourselves prey in these schools and swarms and herds and flocks? We could be the murmuration of the starling, each winged partner coordinating with its 7 most immediate counterparts, creating a pulsing cloud of iridescent black, a visual spectacle of thousands sweeping and dipping, redoubling. This phenomenon actually born an illustrious dance of defense. No scientist able to pinpoint how such vast flocks maneuver with complete cohesion, infinite lives spared through responding to neighbors with speed, grace, and accuracy. No single fowl leading the flock, all movements governed collectively, maintaining motion so fluid it makes the blood in our human veins ache and race with wonder. This intimacy with wind currents, this result of countless butterfly effects crashing over each other's inevitability, tidal wave tendencies. We are tipping points, defying gravity, beautiful causation, in response to considerable peril, organizing for the sake of survival, not just our capability, our responsibility. Every finger and feather and wing and buck and prayer essential. One might think in this fecund wilderness of a world that only the most large, most aggressive entities are allowed to procure safety. But the strength we might find our numbers in are endless and brilliantly adept at converting the horizons into vistas of sweeping change when our little pieces find their perfect places. We realize this skybound mosaic, building 2020 our vision, pushing past the jaded and antiquated naysayers who never took our care into consideration anyway, and putting the current back underneath the wings of we, our people. Good morning.
Bianca, thank you. Oh, I'm like Jamil. I'm all heart beating, but I don't quite have the same rhythm as Jamil. Thank you. So we're about to get started. I just want to lay out what we're going to do, and then we're going to get Professor Shawn Ginwright up here, which we are super excited to have you here. Shawn, thank you for being here. Again, I'm Steve Patrick. Most of the crowd already is suffering from Steve fatigue, so I won't do any more of an introduction than that. That was so powerful. I can't think of a better way to have a conversation about healing than to bring that kind of wisdom right into the room. So I thank you for that. And you have to assume, like, we wouldn't have to have a conversation about healing collectively if we had more of that wisdom and permeate our culture, our society. And I think that's part of what this work is about. It's part of why we rely on the wisdom of young people. It's part of why we point out that for many indigenous people, when the snow falls, it is a super special thing, right? It's auspicious. It's part of why we honor the Ute people whose land we walk on. It's about that wisdom and resurrection of wisdom as a core component of our culture. And so we have the privilege today to talk about, we really collectively as a team, Shawn put out this piece. I think a lot of you have read it. It resonated so strongly with our team. It went viral across the 11 of us. But we know it's gone viral in the field, too, because he's just back from talking to all the funders at Youth Transition Funders Group about this frame. And this is part of the future of the work of all young people being whole, being healthy, all humans being whole, being healthy. And so we couldn't be more excited to have this frame. We're going to have Shawn spend about 20 minutes talking with us about this frame and about this sea change and how we do this work. And then we're going to have three amazing leaders join us in conversation. Some of them you already know. You don't have Shakima fatigue yet. Never. And then we'll have a wonderful conversation with three leaders and Shawn, but I should get off the stage and introduce Professor Shawn Ginwright. Let me just say, Shawn and I met about a decade ago when Hillary and Pennington and I were trying to get the Gates Foundation to invest in organizing, and we brought this sort of rising star and a bunch of organizers to the Gates Foundation. We weren't as successful as we had hoped, but there's still hope for that. And so we hadn't connected until this paper came. I hadn't heard about what he was up to. And so then, if you look on page 24 at his bio, you'll see that dude's been busy since the first time I met him. Incredible amount of work that he's been doing, writing, producing. He's a professor at San Francisco State. He gets to work under the name of the Cesar Chavez Institute. That's like a beautiful responsibility. And he meets that responsibility and then some. So we have a great privilege to hear from Shawn Ginwright, and then we're going to bring the panel up and have a conversation with all of you about this frame. Thank you, Shawn. I'm going to give you a hug when you get up here.
All right, brother.
Go get him.
All right. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, family. I always say it's not a small world. It's a big family. It's good to connect with folks and be able to share these ideas with you. I'm here to share some ideas about what I think are some of the most significant challenges and opportunities that we're facing with young people in America today. I believe that our fight for justice and our fight for equality, our fight for a better way of being in America is not simply a technical battle, but it's also a spiritual battle. And that oftentimes we've engaged in work in thinking of it as a technical way of changing the systems that shape the quality of life for our young people. But we also have to recognize that while we have a lens by which to see the world, our lens tells us that there's racism and that there's structural racism and homophobia and sexism. While we have a lens to see the world, and that lens tells us the conditions that young people must navigate, we also need a mirror. And that mirror requires us to reflect on our own lives, to reflect on the ways in which we've been harmed, to reflect on the ways in which we need to show up as human beings to provide and saturate young people's life with love, care, and hope. So in the next 20 minutes, I just want to share with you, the clicker is missing, so I want to share with you the ideas that I have about healing and what it means for, oh, there it is, I didn't see it. I don't have my glasses on, that's why, y'all. I want to share these ideas about what it really means for healing, and particularly the article about a transition from trauma-informed care to healing-centered engagement, and really what that means for our own lives and for our own work. I like starting with a story. This is a story that happened to me actually about 6 years ago. Some of you may have heard it before, so forgive me if you have. But I was asked to come out to a prison not far from my home. I got an email that said that there are about 10 men in here that have read a prior book that I wrote about black youth in Oakland. And they had been from Oakland, and they were motivated and excited about how I narrated the lives of the young black men that I talk about in the book. And so I debated whether or not I would take that invitation. And so I decided to go ahead and go out to the prison to talk to these men about that book. And so I had prepared my comments. I was prepared to share both the theory and why and how I did the research. And so I went out to the prison. And as I got to the prison, I was met with a correctional officer. And the correctional officer said, Dr. Ginwright, the men are in the cafeteria. They're waiting for you. Just follow the instructions, and the instructions will get you to the cafeteria. So as they opened the gate, the first correctional officer, she said, Dr. Ginwright, follow the yellow line all the way to the end of the corridor. So I looked on the floor, found a yellow line, and I followed it to the end of the corridor where I was met with a door. That door buzzed open, bzzz, and I walked through it. And the door shut behind me, boom. There's another correctional officer there. Hey, Dr. Ginwright, we're glad you're here. The men in the cafeteria, find the red line and take the red line all the way down to the end of the corridor. So I found the red line, followed it down to the end of the corridor. That door buzzed open, bzzz. I walked through it, and it shut behind me, boom. I was met with another correctional officer. You're almost there, Dr. Ginwright. Just follow this blue line all the way to the end of the corridor. You'll be near the cafeteria. I followed that line. I followed it to the end of the long corridor, and the door buzzed open, bzzz, and I walked through the door, and it shut behind me, boom. But something happened inside of me by the time that third door shut. I began to feel the sense of incarceration. I began to feel the sense of enclosure. I began to imagine that the men that I was about to talk to hadn't felt freedom in years. And I began to be really deeply insecure because I had shifted. And what I had prepared to share with them, my theory and my research, I believed was useless at this point. And so as that third door shut, I became increasingly and completely nakedly vulnerable because I was clear that those men, that whatever I was going to say to them could not be about some research. And so as they walked me to the cafeteria, I was shocked at what I saw. I had anticipated 10 men in the cafeteria. As they opened the door, there were 250 men waiting for me in their orange jumpsuits. I was like, damn, y'all. You should have told me. And they were excited to see me, right? And they came up, hey, Dr. Ginwright, we're glad you're here. I remember this brother, his name was Greg. He came up to me. Hey, Dr. Ginwright, my name is Greg. I've been in here since 1989. And my heart sank, man. Another brother, Chris, came up to me. He said, Dr. Ginwright, we're glad you're here, man. We want to hear what you got to say. I've been here since 1985. And one by one, they came and shared their name and the year they had entered this place. And as they shared their year and their name, I became more and more human. I knew that I couldn't speak to them just about my research. And so as I was ushered up onto the stage, I didn't know what I was going to say, y'all. I couldn't talk to them about my research, and so I just talked to them from my heart. And I talked to them about my own son and the concerns I have of raising a 6'3", 16-year-old black boy in Oakland, California, and I was afraid for him. I talked to him about my aging parents and how I didn't know what to do and how to support my aging parents. I just talked to them for about 20, 30 minutes, and one of the things I said to them was that you're not whatever brought you here. And whatever brought you here, there's always redemption, and there's always the possibility of healing and hope. And I shared with them a couple of other things, and my time was up. And so as my time was up, I was ushered off the stage, and they were shaking my hand, and they were telling the brothers that were incarcerated to go back to their cells. And as I was leaving the auditorium, I heard a big booming voice behind me. Hey, Dr. Ginwright. Actually, he said, hey, Dr. G. That's what my students call me. I turned around. And this is a true story, y'all. This brother must have been 7 feet tall, 400 pounds. He was huge. And so I turned around. I said, what's up, bro? Right? And he said, hey, Dr. G, I want to let you know, bro, that those words you shared really touched me, man. They really had an impact on me. I said, I'm glad they did, man. I'm glad. He said, no, you got to understand, it's hard being in a place like this. People think because I'm so tall and big and I'm black that I'm a threat. And I got in a fight in here a few years ago, bruh. They cut me in the face, man, and it's hard to heal from stuff like this. I said, I'm so sorry to hear that, bruh. And he said, I'll never forget, he said, but you know what? There's something that I do every day to keep my healing, to always heal from being in a difficult situation like this. And I said, what do you do? And he reached into his pocket. And I was like, whoa, what are you doing, man? And he reached into his pocket, and he pulled out a little bottle. He opened the bottle, and he blew bubbles. And the bubbles floated over my head, and my first thought was, did this big brother just blow bubbles in my face in prison? And then he said, man, when I was a kid, man, my daddy used to take me to the park, and he would teach me to blow bubbles. So me blowing these bubbles, that's my space of hope. That's my space of healing. It heals me when I do this. And so as I drove back that night from the prison, I began to imagine, what are y'all's bubble stories? What are our bubble stories? How do we heal in a difficult situation that we're in? How do we continue to sustain ourselves in an onslaught of a society that sometimes doesn't support or love its young people? And so I became deeply curious about healing and the ways in which people healed in difficult situations. And I believe that the first thing that I did in my sort of quest for trying to understand how people heal is I began to understand what they heal from. When talking to people in the south side of Chicago or Oakland or San Francisco or New York, they all shared the same common discussion about what they're healing from. And there's challenges to hope and healing. And so in the book, I try to articulate what those challenges are and how people then begin to heal from their exposures to all sorts of challenges that they find in their lives, particularly young people. So the first thing I sort of understood is that people talk about their environments. And the research suggests that in many neighborhoods and schools, that the environments in which we work with young people are toxic. And just like they're physical toxins, in a neighborhood, James Gabarino in his research suggests that there are social equivalents to physical toxins. And physical toxins are things like asbestos and lead paint. If you had asbestos and lead paint in your apartment, your home, or your workplace, over time your exposure to that physical toxicity could be lethal. But James Gabarino says that there are social equivalents, things like fear, anxiety, stress, uncertainty, disappointment, shame. All of these things are significant in the lives of young people, but that go undiagnosed. We also know that we are living in an intensely toxic environment. We know that in the summer of 2015 and 16, the onslaught of black boys are being hunted by police officers and the fear of safety. We also know what's happening with immigrant families and children being caged on the border and being dehumanized. That this environment, right? This environment creates a toxicity, not only for the young people, but for us as well as adults. And that if we're not cognizant about the ways in which toxicity shows up for us, then it's hard for us to identify the toxicity for young people. So what is the result of social toxins then for social conditions on young people, on youth development? How do we sort of understand its impact? This is a framework that I think helps us to sort of think about what social toxicity does and how it shapes our capacity to be more loving and human with young people. This is Mia. Mia is a youth worker. She came into youth work because she deeply loves and cares about young people. But Mia doesn't understand that in her work and love with young people that she's exposed to social toxins. And social toxins are like, if you think about rain clouds, social toxins are like invisible rain clouds. And unlike rain that gets us wet, social toxins get inside of us. They're invisible. They sit there. They're things like shame and fear and anxiety. And when they're there, they influence the capacity for Mia to be more loving and compassionate in her work with young people. So those toxins have an influence on Mia at the interpersonal level, but then Mia also brings those social toxins into her relationships. They have an influence at the interpersonal level. And those social toxins then sometimes find themselves in the very institutions we try to transform. Those social toxins have an influence on the values, they have an influence on the practices, and they have an influence on the policies of those institutions. The institutions themselves then begins to produce more social toxicity. We see this in schools, we see this in probation departments, we see this over and over again. It becomes a cycle of creating and reproducing social toxins. So our jobs are really to find ways to heal young people from exposure. James Bolden says that oftentimes that exposure to social toxins, that trauma, a result in violent behavior, fatalism, depression, anxiety, right? These are symptoms of something much more deep. So the future of healing. In a workshop I was doing with some young people, about 10 young men, about 3 years ago, I was trying to get them to understand about social toxins and the ways in which it influences their own stress level. And as I was asking them to talk about the challenges, and these young men were homeless and they had faced all sorts of trauma. And as I was going around the circle and trying to get them to understand trauma and stress and get them to share their stories, one brother named Marcus stopped me and said, "Dr. Ginwright, man, I'm more than what happened to me. I'm more than just my trauma." And at first I didn't know what he meant. But he was trying to get me to understand that the workshop and the way that I was defining him was relegating him to the thing that happened, not the thing that could be, right? And so when he said that, he shifted me. He said, I also want to be a DJ, right? I also want to be able to open up my own radio store, my own a technology store, right? He began to tell me in his dreams. And so while I thought it was important to understand trauma-informed work, his comment shifted me in thinking about a different possibility. And that is, how do we get young people to dream about other ways of being? And so his comments sort of got me to think about some of the limits of the ways in which we think about trauma-informed care, right? And trauma-informed care tends to see the trauma as an individual experience versus a collective one. We know that black and brown children don't experience fear from the police at an individual level. These are collective phenomena. We know that oftentimes trauma-informed care doesn't address the root cause of the problem, right? That oftentimes trauma is not something that accidentally happened to you, but it is an intentional act of policy that created the conditions for trauma to occur. So we have to think about the root causes of young people's trauma and not just think of it as an episodic event. The third is that oftentimes trauma focuses on coping, man, instead of healing. And what I mean by coping is that how can I navigate? How can I overcome? How can I deal with the thing that happened as opposed to resolve it and see beauty and love and hope in my future? That's healing. And so while it's important that we have trauma-informed work and trauma-informed care, my point is that it's important, but it's incomplete. And so what I argue is that we need to shift from trauma-informed care to healing-centered engagement. And healing-centered engagement is a way that we think more holistically about the capacity to see the humanity in young people and see the humanity in ourselves. And there's just 4 points that I think are important in our thinking about healing-centered engagement. One, that we have to think of healing-centered engagement as explicitly political as opposed to clinical. That means that we have to understand that trauma is a result of political and policy decisions. It is not only a treatment, right? And when we see trauma as a function of political decisions, then that is a political response. That means that we have to think about transforming the policies and the conditions that cause the trauma in the first place. Second, healing-centered engagement is culturally grounded and views healing as a root restoration of identity. A friend of mine says, la cultura cura. The culture cures, right? And that many times young people find themselves with shame. That's a form of trauma, y'all. To be ashamed of your thick lips and kinky hair. To be ashamed of your language. To be ashamed of your accent, right? These are other forms of trauma that oftentimes if we don't get at, right, if we don't get at how our culture provides a pathway for us to become healing and whole again. Third is that healing-centered engagement is an asset-driven approach. It focuses on well-being rather than the symptoms we want to suppress. Healing-centered engagement says, what do you dream about? What do you want to be? What is your hopes, right? So that we don't only focus on this suppressing anxiety or suppressing the kind of symptoms that we don't want to see in behavior, but we also foster and think about what we want to create. And then lastly, healing-centered engagements supports adult providers with their own healing. And I wish I had a little more time to go into this point, because we cannot think about healing as a one-way street. We need healing too, right? There are things that we grapple with, the stories that young people bring to us, the conditions that young people experience in their community has an impact on our own ability to be whole and show up in a human way, right? So we need to think about healing in our own work. Not just professional development. We're more than just professionals. We're human beings. So we need a strategy to support the healing of the adults so that they can show up more human for the young people in which they love and care about. So how do we foster healing? This is a quick metaphor, and then I'm going to give you some recommendations. A friend of mine is a botanist at UC Berkeley. And she liked the metaphor around toxicity. And she said, we used to take these plants, and I know Steve talked to you about the Aspen trees. So this is sort of a building off of that, right? She talked about they do this experiment where they put these plants in these toxic chambers, and they would pump the toxic gas into these chambers. And they would look at the response to the plant to the toxic gas. And she said that the plants would oftentimes die in different ways. I'm like, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about death. I'm talking about love and happiness, right? And she said, no, Dr. Ginwright, like another time we took a community of plants, and we took those same plants and we put them all together in the toxic gas chamber. And we still pumped it with gas, but because the plants were together, they did something differently. They began to take different nutrients out of the soil. They began to metabolize those different nutrients in a different way, and the plants began to emit a gas in the chamber that cleaned up the toxic gas we were pumping in. That's healing, y'all. That's what I think our work is about, is transforming the work we do to heal the toxicity that we have in our society. And so there are some recommendations that I want to end with that I think are important for us to consider. The first is, how do we think about building organizational supports that integrate healing practice into the day-to-day engagement with young people? This is not just youth development, but it's thinking about how do we look at healing in our own practice, but what practices do we engage in on a regular basis that's about our healing? Second, we need to build systems of support to strengthen staff's own social emotional growth and well-being. This seems to say we're shifting our focus from young people. But my point is that we cannot heal young people if we're sick. We cannot heal young people if we're dealing with stuff. So we have to begin to think about building systems of support in schools and youth development programs and organizations that focus on nurturing the adults in a human way. Third, we need to track measures of hope and well-being that moves beyond only academic and youth development outcomes, right? This means is that sometimes there's a tendency for us to measure misery. I'll say it again. We just want to, sometimes we measure misery. We want to measure the ending of what we don't want to see, as opposed to trying to measure what we want, right? Fourth is the healing-centered engagement. We need to create healing-centered opportunities, not trauma-informed. We already covered that. But we also need to create equity-based social-emotional learning strategies in schools and youth development programs. And then lastly, we need to support youth development workers with transformative change over personal development, right? We're not just professionals, but we have to think about transforming our lives. So I want to end with this quote by Michelle Alexander, who in my view is one of the most brilliant minds since W.E.B. Du Bois. And she says, she's a legal scholar, she's written for years, legal brilliance. And then 3 years ago in the New York Times, she said, I'm not writing about law anymore. She says, I'm not going to talk about law anymore because those tools get us only so far. And she says that the problems we face in America are not simply political or policy problems. At its core, America's problems raise profound moral and spiritual questions about who we are, who we aim to become, and what we're willing to do about it now. Thank you very much, Aspen. Thank you, brother.
That's awesome.
Thank you, man.
You mind doing down there?
Feel beautiful. Thanks, man.
Yeah, you've done. Holy cow. You can't drop the mic when it runs up through your shirt and is clipped, but drop the mic, Shawn. Dr. G, if I may, because I feel like a student. I just learned. All right, we're going to have a conversation. Let me just start with basic. Oh, the clicker, yes. We're going to have a clicker and a conversation. So here's who we have with us, and I encourage you to look at the bios. I already mentioned Dr. G's is on page 24. We'll amend it to add the G part. We'll jump in, and then we'll bring you all into this, because I can feel there's some energy in the room. So first, Carlos Rojas joins us. Welcome. It's really a privilege to have you here. Thank you. He leads a bunch of work at Youth on Board that focuses on this kind of approach. Is that a fair way to say?
Absolutely, yeah.
Everybody knows Youth on Board? Raise your hand if you're aware. Yeah, I mean, based in Boston, great resources for this kind of work, great resources around youth organizing, youth-led, youth engagement. And so it's really a privilege to have you here. Thank you, for joining us. Cheryl Davis. You all know her, San Francisco Human Rights Commission. It's great to be with you and good to see you, per usual. Shakima Fulmore Townsend.
Good morning.
You're familiar with her work in Philly. We're going to see a lot of that work in May, and it's a real privilege to have Shakima back with us, per usual. So let's just start with reactions, and maybe Carlos, maybe you want to jump in first, but whoever's moved to respond and connect this to your own work and how this frame fits with what you're doing, maybe even some of how it might shift what you're doing. But let's jump in. And Monique's notes tell me to call on you first, but we can go anywhere we want.
You feel like talking? Carlos, you got it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm processing so much of what you said. Yesterday, I ran a session that some of you might have been at, where I shared the Youth on Board's action and support model. And I think everything that we did and what I managed to share in an hour and a half, I think mirrors and resonates with what you just laid out in such a significant way. My journey of discovering what healing means was a little different. And I always start with a story about foot pain. I was maybe 15 or 16, and my brother was 8 or 9. And he had this routine almost every night of having foot pain. And my mom would have to come into our room, because we shared a room, and she would have to give him rubbing alcohol and rub it all over his feet. And then the pain would go away, and then he could fall asleep. And I got really curious about why almost every night my brother had pain, and I believed him. I don't think he was lying. And that my mom would have to rub rubbing alcohol on his foot, and then he would be able to fall asleep. So one night I walked into our room, and he asked me to call our mom because he needed his nightly dose of rubbing alcohol. And I decided to ask him when the pain had started, if he could remember when the pain started. And he thought about it and then remembered that when he was 5, or maybe younger, he had woken up with foot pain, but he was really scared to tell anyone. He didn't wake me up. He didn't wake our mom up. Something, as a 5-year-old boy, told him that he couldn't wake us up because of foot pain. And he said he spent that whole night with foot pain. He couldn't sleep. And I got him to talk about it to the point where I noticed that he started to get really red. You know when someone's about to cry and their voice starts to sound like this? And I listened to him, and then he said, "Go get the rubbing alcohol." And I said, "Maybe not tonight." And I had never heard the kinds of screams that came out of my brother before that night. He was like, "You're going to kill me! You're killing me!" And he kept crying and crying and raging, and "I need this alcohol! I need this!" And he just kept crying and screaming, and I stayed really close to him, and I listened to him, and I said, "I think you can get over this pain." And he cried for maybe 2 hours. At the end of it, he fell asleep crying. And I'm not lying when I say from that day forward, he never, ever, ever, ever had foot pain again. Wow. Before nighttime. And what I realized that night was that I didn't just get him to cry about the foot pain. I think that what I managed to do was get him to cry about that night as a 5-year-old boy, where he wasn't able to wake anyone up because as a boy he felt like he might be troubling us or he couldn't complain about the pain. I got him to cry about a whole night that he spent in bed in pain alone. And he never had foot pain ever again. He never needed it. And I would not have been able to do that if I hadn't learned what I learned at Youth on Board, which is that emotions are okay. Letting your emotions out is okay. Letting your emotions out while people are listening to you intently and with love and warm attention is even better than doing it alone. And that if we do that enough over and over again, and if we hold people's hands while we look at the darkest things that have happened to us as people, and we let those things out, then we can actually start to heal. And when we heal, what we mean by that is we get our brains back. we get our full intelligence back. We get the ability to think and see the present for what it is and not for what it feels like because of what happened to us when we were very little. And so, Dr. Ginwright, what you laid out is exactly what I experienced as a young person in this program. It resonates so much with me. I'll leave it with that story, but I'm excited to delve deeper later on in the conversation about how do we actually do that? What are the mechanisms? So many times I'm sure you have people in front of you talking about healing and the importance of healing, but very little do people leave you with actual steps for how to do it. And so I'm excited for the conversation that's going to follow.
Great, thank you. Cheryl, let's turn to you. In fact, I wasn't following Monique's script. You should have called me out on that, because I really do want to ask you to talk about your work and the frame that you're working with in San Francisco. So,
Great.
Would you? Yeah.
I will. Can you hear me? Okay. Let's see. I started out as a kindergarten teacher, so I like visuals and I like to do things in story. I think I'm at the end. Can we? Okay. So I'm going to share a little bit about San Francisco, and what really is interesting to me is that as Dr. G was talking, I realized that I am definitely one of the adults that needs healing and is not yet. He and his wife have tried to work with me and get me healed. It's taken a little bit longer than expected.
We all healers.
Healing, right? Process.
But this idea of culture and spirit, and that's part of what we've been trying to do in San Francisco. We have several community collaboratives which are based in really how do we do this with the lens of thinking about our Latinx community, our African American community, our PI, and Pacific Islander, and what does it look like to be really youth-led? And one of the challenges for us is this idea of healing-centered opportunities versus the trauma-informed opportunities. And I say that because when we've gone through some of these young people who are probably on the path to being incarcerated or who have come out, and they say to us, I want to go to the zoo, right? And we're like, you are 19, why would we take you to the zoo? But the reality of it is to this idea of the things that didn't happen in their youth, the things that they need to get back and to actually live their childhood are core and important to that healing process, and we need to listen to young people in that process. So youth-centered and youth leadership is what we're trying to do from all those different cultural lenses. Sorry. So I'll just keep going and say that ultimately.
Next slide. You can do it from there. The next slide. Thank you.
So the cultural identity and appropriation has been really something, and the idea and notion of how we move through this work in terms of cultural and spiritual. And I like to say that our ancestors got it right. The indigenous people, our Negro spirituals, all of that, they got it right. They understood the tie between culture and spirit, and that there are all these studies now about the idea of spirituality leading to hope, which leads to self-sufficiency. So if we're going to talk about spirit and culture, we need to actually dig down and understand that piece, right? Like this idea of the medicinal drumming that's happening on the next slide with within our Latinx community and what that looks like. But also when I think about Harriet Tubman and the poems and the songs and this idea of using music to get from one place to another, or this idea of hope and healing, really being able to help our young people own that, right? Understanding that Swing Low, Sweet Chariot wasn't just about going to heaven, but it was also about how do we get through this movement right now? How do you understand that that is the call for you to come meet me? I'm going to get you to freedom, that piece of it. And what I like about our folks in the Mission and Roadmap to Peace that's doing the drumming is that they have actually trained young people to do that, and that they then go out into community and share that work. But in the same way, we have our young people that are doing spoken word. We need to value that. That are writing their own music. We need to value that and sharing their experiences. If we move to the next slide, this idea of how we bring people in is really important. Like doing it communal and not saying, oh, that's that group's thing or that's that group's thing, but it's all of our thing. Like if we really go back in history, drumming is a part of all of what we do, right? And if we could do more of the drumming, then maybe we'd do a little bit less of beating up on each other, like working our energy and our emotions out on a drum. And I think missing that in terms of what our culture and what it was that we were meant to do. There has been this idea, notion around storytelling and changing the narrative. What's really important around changing the narrative is who tells the stories. On this next slide, there is this imagery about like what it looks like, diversity in books. And if we look at that, like animals, trucks, inanimate objects have more book time than people of color, right? And so what is that message? How are we passing down history and culture if we are not represented in books? How do we get the story out? How do we make people feel valued or important? And then in some of those books, all we get are not regular everyday, like it's normal to be a person of color. It has to be the story of King, or it has to be Cesar Chavez, or it has to be some amazing thing. It doesn't celebrate just everyday life of people of color. And so part of that is that what we've done is that we've tried to think about how we have young people tell stories, how we have young people share their experiences. And we don't need to look far. The studies show that there's therapy in writing, right? There's therapy in getting that out of what's inside of you and putting it on paper. So part of the work that we're doing is saying, let's put it on paper. But the next piece of that is building a safe space that you can take what's on paper and speak it. And that's the hardest part. Because that thing that's inside you that it took so long to write, to make yourself vulnerable enough to share it in front of folks. So that's where adults need to do a little bit more. Like as we move to the next slide, like there's this how do we write, taking that space, and then on the next slide is how do adults stop asking young people to do what you're not willing to do.
Come on, come on, come on.
When we ask a young person to write, if you're not willing to sit down and write with them, don't expect them to write. Because it's not a safe space. If you're not willing to put yourself out there, why should they be? And so part of this healing is, again, like to Dr. G's point, how are adults being a part of that? How are you modeling what you're asking them to do? And how are you dealing with your own stuff, right? Which is hard because we don't want to admit that we have stuff, but we cannot help them. The next one is about now how do we take that, take the stories and what they've written, give them space and place to like share that. I think ultimately, for me, we talk about how do we build adult allies and not saviors. How do we create a space where we come in and are actually working with young people? How are we working with them to amplify their voices? There's this new thing, youth-initiated mentoring, right? Which is about not how do we pair young people with mentors, but how do we prepare them to identify mentors that work for them.
Yes.
Right? So as we do this work, it's really about how do we fall back on how we think we know what's best and actually provide space for young people to tell us what's best and to actually honor that. And that is part of this process in San Francisco is like, how do we use song? How do we use music? How do we identify culture and understand the spirituality of that storytelling, of that singing, of that dancing that gives us hope that moves us to the next level?
Damn. Thank you.
Yes.
Shakima, you were actually visibly responding, so jump in with Project U-Turn.
So I'm gonna not jump in with Project U-Turn,
Okay,
Steve, if
jump
that's
in.
okay with you.
Let's just keep the theme going of me being floundering here. Go ahead. Sorry.
That's okay. So good morning, everyone. I made a couple of choices very early on in my career, and the reason why I was getting so excited, I've gone through every emotion up here, from my legs shaking, my heart beating really fast, because I can feel the presence of the divine, and it physically envelops me. And what I had to discover was that when I own my story, then no one can make me feel shame about my father being in jail, or my life, or me, finding crack valves in the bedroom that I shared with my mother, or spending up until I was 37 when my mom apologized for leaving me with my grandmother, and recognizing that, like, she always thought of herself as a good mother for making a choice to leave me with my grandmother. And I say, thank God she left me with my grandmother. Like, that's my boo. I love her. And I know that every time when I think about this, I have to kind of put her out here. Me and Ronnie, my mom is Veronica. I would not be here if Ronnie was left to her own devices to make sure that there was a Shakima. I made some choices, and so when Dr. G was talking about walk this color line and walk this color line, and every time a door slammed, it kept making me think about this choice to move forward. And some choices that I made as a leader early on when I went into rooms, especially where you're going into cross-systems conversations, where people are super comfortable saying a lot of things that were completely insulting to young people, and they were supposed to be there to help, right? And so I couldn't understand how victimized people were trying to help victims, and they could not really own, and they were being oppressive. And so once, I will tell you, I got in a lot of trouble in my career. I was just too young some people say I was too young to understand, but the truth of the matter is I calculated the cost and I took the risk. So, at the end of the day, I made some choices to do a couple of things. One, I don't tell young people's story. It's not my story to tell. I tell you my story. So when people ask me, what does poverty look like? Hello. I grew up in poverty. I'm also able to look at the first generation of my family outside of poverty when I look at my daughters, right? They have never known a impoverished day of their lives. Some days I threaten to drop them in the projects and just see if they Now we go visit because my grandmother still lives in public housing, so does my mother, right? And so I am the reflection of a cycle breaker. When you choose to, listen, don't get me started because I think a big challenge that we have is that a lot of adults who are in the business of youth development are cycle breakers, and we don't have supports for cycle breakers because it's lonely. You got to find examples to figure out how to be financially responsible, how to get through your education, and you don't have the examples. I could not ask my mother. I could not ask my aunt. You know why? Because I was the first one going. And then they glorify that. So there's a myth in my family. They think I wear a super cape. Anything they're trying to do, they think I can do it. I'm trying to start a business. Why you think that I know about that? I'm trying to do this. But because they see me accomplish certain things, that fortitude gives them the impression that anything is possible. So for me, as a leader, I choose, one, to own and tell my own story. That's enough, quite frankly. Number two, I try to use the personal use of self. So I'm not telling you my story to make you feel sorry for me or to glorify me. I only tell my story when it is productive and will move the conversation. Yeah. And so if it's not that, when we released our 2020 vision, I told my story. And my team said, we did not know. It was none of y'all business. We weren't doing that. And then my board asked me, we should take your story on the road. No, we will not. I told that story once and I won't tell it in that way ever again because it was useful to evolving our organization and systems. So I think owning your own story, telling why you show up in the work, being willing to be vulnerable. I was walking around a path one day, and I'll tell you my moment of healing. I was walking around a path in my neighborhood one day, and people will think I'm crazy, but we pray to God, and we don't think that that's crazy. When we talk about God talking back to us, sometimes people think you're crazy. I can hear God say very clearly to me, I gave you the parents that you had so that you could become everything you needed to be. And in that moment, I stopped being angry with my father for not being there. I stopped being frustrated with my mother for not being able to let drugs go earlier on in life and for essentially what she apologized for, which was abandoning me. And so you have two parents who have abandoned you and left you with, my grandmother. And I was able to stand in the fullness of, I needed those experiences to become and live in the space that I am and to be a champion for young people. And I've also made the choice to always, anytime I'm in the presence of youth and young adults, to see their dreams with them and to not define them by the circumstances, because I'm a 39-year-old woman who is running a $20+ million nonprofit. My story and my history, just because I went to the University of Pennsylvania, I went to boarding school, that is not the circumstances that I came up with, and people make assumptions about how I got where I got, but I use that to say that it's not that it's easy. It is hard, and I face a lot of challenges on a regular basis, but it is possible. And so whatever dream, I always dreamed of helping other people who looked like me. That was as the simple version of the dream. But your gift will make room for you. And so my gift has taken me before great men, and I tell young people to find your gift, and you'll never work a day in your life. Find your passion, and it will actually fuel the rest of your life. If you can find it, and you can nurture it, along with the experiences that are developing you, then you are unstoppable. And the trick of the enemy is to have you believe that these circumstances and these people have something to give or something to take away from you. When the truth of the matter is the divine is already worked out for you, and that these experiences that you step along are either going to take you closer to your journey or around it. But it will never take you from your journey.
Preach.
It will never take you from your journey. And if I can teach every young person that I encounter that their journey and their destination is graspable, it's reachable, and the choices you make will either get you faster or get you around it. I never said it would not get you to it. So if I can get every young person to switch that mind frame, for me, that is my gift back. That's my thank you. Because I feel like that's the gift that I've received, and that's how I honor it.
Preach.
Y'all don't make me cry.
Shawn, why don't you talk, man? You want to respond to that?
I don't have.
All right. Here's what I will say. That was healing centered. That you just epitomized that for us. Thank you. One question for us to take this out from ourselves, and it was amazing to hear a through line of the deeply personal for each of you in this work, and how that self-healing reflected, or how it starts with young people, whether they're 5 years old. Where do you start to accumulate this toxicity? Probably from day one. I mean, the data on the books is unbelievable to me. And so, in a lot of ways, it's the toxicity in the air we breathe that you were describing so well, Dr. G. And it's a lot like what Brian Stevenson tells us, right? That we do winning in America. We don't do truth. We don't do healing. We don't do reconciliation. And that we all walk around breathing that toxic air, and that we are all worse for it. And I agree that none of us are, what you learned and you already knew when you went to visit that prison, that none of us should be defined by the worst thing we ever did or the worst thing that ever happened to us. But how do we now, we're living in Agent Orange toxicity right now, dude. It is deep. And so how do we bring that into the culture? How do we really make that part of the structures that we're working in? You've really begun to hit on it. Each of you brings that into the structures of your work. But let's talk about how we make this the common experience versus a very unique, set of things that happen only in pockets and in cracks. Anybody want to respond to that question?
Well, I'll just say off the top, one of the things that I took from the book Jeff Chang's We Gonna Be All Right is this idea of how do we embed culture, right? How will culture survive? And that ultimately America doesn't have, like other countries, culture embedded in the day-to-day and infrastructure. So really thinking about how do we begin to change the overall system to make culture embedded into that work.
Yeah, beautiful.
Oh, go ahead. I was going to say, I don't think we don't have to technically create a healing-centered movement. It's being birthed as we witness it. And I think that this space that we're in right now has a function, has a purpose, has a human-directed purpose for a greater cultural evolution, right? That I think that without, we don't have to think about this sort of movement as, creating greater funding streams and figuring out all these technical things. The communities are yearning and doing it anyway, right? Mm-hmm. All this is a reflection of what's happening and occurring. And I think that those of us who have done years and years and years of organizing, thinking about movement building, thinking about how to transform systems, that one of the things I tell my graduate students is that the greatest casualty of oppression is not blocked opportunities. The greatest casualty of oppression is not limited opportunities, but it is the destruction of our ability to dream. And that means that oppression tells us that all we can do is fight it. Right? But we have a greater responsibility. We have to fight and block oppression, but we have the responsibility to dream beyond it. And if we don't do that, y'all, we create the same systems that created the conditions in the first place. We just move the blocks around in the same system. And so I think our role, right, our role is sort of in this movement about healing is to take that courageous act and really begin to dream and think beyond how can we transform the system so that they support young people of color in ways that see in their full humanity, as opposed to shifting the blocks in the same puzzle.
We founded Listening Works out of Youth on Board after the 2016 elections because I think not a month after the elections, we noticed a horribly toxic culture in our social movements. A month into the elections, 2 coalitions in our city broke down of young people of color. I saw national movements splinter, unable to talk to each other, unable to cooperate, unable to resolve and lean into conflict and differences. And so what we saw was not just a toxic culture out there. What we saw was a toxic culture that was deeply embedded in our social movements.
That's right.
The movements that are supposed to build a better world. And so one of the things that we often think about for us is what is our goal, what is our North Star? What is the compass that is going to keep me fighting and not giving up on myself and not giving up on the people around me? What is that belief? What is that phrase that keeps your mind on the prize? And for us, it's 3 not so simple statements that I had the people that came to my workshop yesterday walk through. And these are our North Stars. And as I say them, I challenge you to think about what are your North Stars? What is the compass that's going to guide you, no matter how toxic, how discouraging, how angry you might get at the people around you? The first statement is all people are good. For us, it is deeply important to believe and hold on to truth that all people are inherently good. This is not just true about yourself. This is not just true about the people immediately around you in your community, but it is true universally. And if we don't believe that,
That's right.
then we're going to have a really hard time building the world we want to see. The second statement that is our North Star is all people get hurt. Fundamental to our model is that believing that all people get hurt. If you think about a newborn baby being born into this world, needing affection, love, care, not to mention the basic necessities, food, shelter, protection, almost no one on this earth gets all of that. A lot of us were born not even getting the basic necessities, and even those of you who got the basic necessities, who were born into privilege, I know you did not get all the love, affection, and attention you needed, right? And so when we grow up, we walk around as hurt adults, people who didn't get everything we needed. The third statement that is our North Star is all people can heal. I have to believe that there is the ability in every single person to be able to heal. Now, do you have to want to heal in order to do it? Probably. But every person in this room, and I think every person on this planet, has the ability to heal, to get their brains back from the effects of oppression. So what is your North Star? What is the compass that is going to keep you moving in the direction you know you need to keep moving in, which is the direction of building relationships with people, reaching across when it's too difficult, when it feels just too hard to keep reaching? Raise your hand if you unfriended someone on social media because of what they said, instead of maybe asking them out for coffee, getting to know them as a human being, and communicating your thinking in a way that could maybe get through to them.
Come on.
Right? I mean, I'm guilty of that, right? You sit there and you say, what? Block, delete. Raise your hand if you consider yourself really good at fighting for other people. You're good at connecting them to resources. You're good at changing policies and laws. Keep your hand raised if you're coming home to a messy apartment or house. Keep your hand raised if some of your personal relationships are a little bit in shambles. Raise your hand if you can't get that application done that you know will make your life easier, but you just can't get it done for some reason. This is really the state of most people on the front lines of our social movements. Burnt out, unable to fight for ourselves, and unable to see that this movement and this revolution has to be about us first and foremost if we're going to create a better world.
Okay. We got to go to Q&A. I want to give you a chance to respond if you want to, or raise your hand if you want to.
You know, for me, it all goes back to this idea and notion. Like, I think in poetry and song, and so as we go through all of this, it's like, what are the tools that we are giving? And I just always go back to Langston Hughes, what happens to a dream deferred? You know, does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or does it fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? And that tool, in those moments when I'm like, where am I? Like the dream, I feel like it's lost. But to Dr. G's point, just to say it's not lost, it's deferred, and what state am I in, and how am I gonna move forward? It's about the tools. I just think, what are we giving people to cope in those moments of despair and hopelessness?
Wow. Okay, we actually ran out of time. I know a lot of people have questions. We're gonna, we have time for questions, Monique? Okay, we've been given the authority to take. So raise your hand. What we're gonna do is take 3, ask our panelists to respond to the one that they most want to respond to, and weave in their final comments with the response. This has to have a question mark on the end of it, and it can be a paragraph, but it has to be a short paragraph. Thank you, Michelle.
Good morning. I just wanted to thank you. I'm standing here with a very open heart, and I appreciate the capacity of all of you to create this social field that I can feel shared amongst this room. So just wanted to say thank you for that. My question is in response to the comment that was made about the way oppression, sort of the disastrous impact of oppression taking away the capacity of dreaming. And I am thinking about myself having worked and operated primarily within the dream of wanting our public systems and the adults within them to operate fundamentally different. And I am waking up into the reality, the felt reality over the last year, that those very systems were founded on the beliefs that people are not able to organize themselves around healing and around caring for themselves. And so we created these structures that are designed to help people from the outside. And so I am myself trying to struggle around the question around what is the sort of, what are we doing to iterate change that is in systems that are transactionally based, or do we fundamentally think about change outside of them? And I'm really struggling with that dichotomy, and I can't form the question inside of that, but I'm really interested in your thinking about it.
That was a deep and hard and significant question. Thank you, Michelle. So, can we get some easy ones now? Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Ginwright. I'm a physician, so I tend to think in my lane. So there's been about 10 years worth of research showing that all of the things you're talking about are actually what makes the life expectancy of Black and brown people shorter, that racism is actually bad for you and it kills you. And it is that shame, and if you measure how much shame and oppression people have felt, those people have higher blood pressure, they have heart attacks, they die sooner. There's very little shown to ameliorate that at all, but a little bit in some of the research in Berkeley has shown that men who had a pro-Black bias actually didn't have that problem. So they had the same number of oppressive events, and then they did not have high blood pressure. There's a little bit showing that people who, that there are some characteristics that maybe are protective, and I think we maybe already know what those are, because we see the people who seem not to have as much problem, but I don't really have an articulation of what do we think our way of giving those to people. Because if I'm trying to then have you not die sooner, that's my job. I can't just treat you once you get sick. I need to figure out some way to be supporting things that make you safe from these toxins early on in your life. And making everybody pro-Black is possible, maybe, but probably not an only strategy. Do you have other strategies that you think are protective from those toxins? Because for me, those are health strategies.
We're not supposed to answer now?
You're not supposed to, but there are no rules right now. So go ahead, Dr. Real quick.
I just want to it's kind of like playing double judge. I just want to jump in. So I think that's to both questions, that's the role of our institutions. So I believe that we have to rethink what we mean by education. We think of education in schools as places of learning, not as places of belonging. And I think our role in schools is to provide ways in which we saturate young people with those kind of healing opportunities, whether it be around gender, whether it be about racial identity, but it's to provide that environment. And it's really, to the first question, is to use these institutions to transform our technical way of being with each other to transformative ways of being with each other. That means that teachers are human beings and show up as human beings for students, and vice versa. So Ayanna, I think that schools play a significant role in being able to provide young people with those kinds of supports and protective factors.
Can I just add to, sorry.
Yes, you may. There's no
to that,
rules.
one of the things that we've been doing is working with our community collaboratives around curriculum that embeds, that talks about, like, you know, get on board, little children, get on, like what that really is about. Like, how do we use the culture and embed it and make it a through line and talk about Kendrick and all of that. So it also is about not just our schools, but our service providers and our folks that are with young people outside of the school day. How do we talk about it in that reflective manner?
Okay, we don't have time for, I'm going to violate all rules. I may lose my job, but just the question, and then we're going to close and with short answers, and thank you.
Great, really short question. What are some of the practices that you all do personally to maintain your healing that you can share with the audience? And sub-question, when does the offering basket get passed around? Because I feel like I just went to church.
We got plenty of 501c3s to direct you all around you. Let's go with the quick closing and response, and we'll wrap this up.
I have multiple forms of meditation I do every day to prepare me for whatever is to come, from exercise to just silent time.
I have three things. One, I had to accept that I was the source of my own crazy, and that was hard for me. Two, say no, and that's it. I'm not saying nothing else after no, so I can have my time back, and I'm not gonna be guilty about saying no. And three, I pray and I work out every day at 5 o'clock in the morning, not because I'm trying to get super skinny, but because there is a council of women at multiple stages that I've experienced, and so I can get everything worked out at my 5 o'clock gym class, from CEO to wife to mom. I take all my problems there, we work out, and in the last 15 minutes, I gather the council, I get the sage advice and move forward. So asking for help would be the last part.
That's great. I feel like I'm addressing Michelle's question and also your question at the same time. Sometimes we think these are really complicated things, healing, and actually we can take really simple steps. Creating a culture of appreciation where we shower each other with appreciations outside of our value of the work that we do, but just appreciating people for who they are is a really key and often missing part of our organizing and our organizations and lives. Laughing and playing a lot is a really important component of healing. And then I would say, one of the things we train people on is knowing how to set up listening partnerships. Choose two people in your life that you trust and care about, and tell them that you want to split time with them, that you're gonna listen to each other for 10 minutes each, and you're just gonna listen, and you're gonna work through anything you need to work through, and get in the habit of doing that with people in your life that you care about. And you can bring that easily to your organization as well. And I'll say we have a website, youthonboard.org/listeningworks, where you can get a lot of downloadable resources on really simple, but also then not so simple ways to really bring a culture of healing into wherever you work and even your personal life.
So I would say I try to pray and meditate every day. It doesn't happen, but what I do try to do is go to, which this might be inappropriate to say. I try to go to my Black Baptist church on a regular because it's the one place I can cry and scream and clap and yell and nobody will think anything is wrong with me.
Great.
That's right.
I started by mentioning that in a lot of land-based, traditional, wisdom-based cultures that snow is auspicious. And so maybe my answer is to the question about wellness is to recognize and acknowledge the beauty in nature and try to carry that inside yourself, and I hope we all will. Wow, I'm going to use one other traditional response, and wisdom-based response, which to this incredible panel, which is, in some cultures, the most you can do to show respect is touch a person's feet. So I have to say thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Please thank these guys for what they've done.
Thank you.
Unbelievable. I'm sorry, I got so confused. I know you. I know you. Hey, man. Thank you. We don't always hug out.
See you back here at 1 o'clock for lunch. Thank you.